Hello there guys and welcome back to the channel. So quite few of you recently have noticed that in some of my videos I am running Suicide Masteries and Mystic Dispersion, and you're asking me for my kind of exact mastery setup. So let's get the first things out of the way. This is how my defense typically looks like. I hardly ever touch it at all. The only times I really change anything at all in the defense is either when I have to remove the willpower in case I'm fighting like a warlock boss in Alliance War or something of the sort, or when I need to access Resonate Mastery, then obviously I add one in Inequity and Resonate. I typically do not run Coagulate, even though I play Suicides quite frequently, and I just kind of choose to take that little bit of damage. But in reality, most of the time when you play Suicides, you also play Suicide-friendly champions, and that Coagulate becomes kind of mute. For instance, Corvus really doesn't need it. That makes no difference whatsoever. Neither does Black Widow Clairvoyant, or Omega Red, or Ghost, and you guys kind of see the trend over there, as well as when you are using Nick Fury and Gold Pulse Energy, for instance. Bleed is a debuff that gets purified at the beginning of the fight, therefore Coagulate again once doesn't really matter because the bleed is kind of like non-existent. So I typically do not touch Coagulate at all. When it goes to my proficiency, this is my bare bone structure. I always max out Parry and I always max out Stupefy, because I find it extremely important in a world where pretty much everything has Limber maxed out, or Limber is present in so many different nodes, or because of so many champions kind of rely on being able to land those heavy attacks that every bit of parry stand duration kind of matters. Only one one point in dexterity. So offensively, we're going to start with our typical offensive tree, as we always kind of do it. And yeah, so we start with 1 in strength, 1 in greater strength, 1 in courage, 1 in pierce. We're going to go ahead and add 1 in a lesser precision. We're going to go and do 4 in greater precision, and honestly I haven't noticed that big of a difference when it comes to like hit counts when I run 4 or 5 in greater precision. So I typically leave precision at 4. I haven't really been maxing it out in a really long time. Now cruelty is the one I still do max out, so I do put on maximum points available in cruelty. But this is a video about how to run Suicide Masteries and Mystic Dispersion at the same time, and there is a very kind of like simple sacrifice you have to make. And for those of you who have been playing this game for ages, you probably do remember the times when this tree didn't exist, when there was no Despair Mastery, there was no Deep Wounds, there was no Assassin, and that is quite unfortunately pretty much the compromise you kind of have to make at this point. If you want to have Suicides and Mystic Dispersion, then you cannot gain points for Deep Wounds. That is kind of like the big write-off, because I really don't miss Assassin that much, and I don't typically even like max it out. I typically leave it at 1. Now Despair is one mastery that I definitely do miss. I rely on it a lot, and Deep Wounds obviously are quite useful as well, especially if you run bleed characters. But luckily most of the suicide friendly characters do not really need that bleed and the Deep Wounds that come with it. So then we're gonna go ahead and activate our Suicide Masteries. 1 in Glass Cannon, 1 in Recoil, max out Liquid Courage, and max out Double Edge. Now this would be kind of like the end of our offensive setup. We will not use any more points offensively, and this is basically where we end up at. And when it comes to our utilities, now you can kind of like decide whether you want 4 or 5 in a Limber. I typically like to max out the Limber out of all of these masteries over here, because then also in kind of sense of economy, I can just redo my offensive tree and leave the defensive tree for, as is for Alliance War defense. And then we can do a couple points here in Mystic Dispersion. We can choose when we want to go up as much as up as we want to go realistically. Most of the time, once again, I run it and leave it at 4 points, and now that leaves us with 2 points that you can kind of distribute wherever you want. Some people would probably prefer maxing out Courage Mastery, some people would prefer maxing out Glass Cannon, because I do find that quite useful mastery. I can put 2 points in Despair Mastery, which is also still noticeable and still can like kind of give you fairly decent effect. If it was me personally, I would probably just go all out and add it all in Glass Cannon, and that is pretty much the setup. And once again, if you want to go back to running no suicides, and if you want to go to point where you're running your deep wounds and stuff like that, you can leave your proficiencies and defense as they are. They will let you have sufficient amount of points, and I'm going to. So this is basically my suicides with Mystic Dispersion build when I'm showcasing Mystic Champions, or when I'm running Mystic Champions in kind of like specific piece of content. And it works quite well with most of the champions. Only real sacrifice you have made is the deep wounds, which occasionally can be kind of like a bit annoying, but other than that, it works perfectly well. And then the good bit is, if you want to take off your suicides, it's also not that hard. You go back once again to your kind of like base setup, and you go back with the 1 courage point, 1 point in Pierce, 1 in lesser precision, 4 in greater precision, and then quite cheaply you have taken off your suicides, and you're kind of like ready to tackle whatever content you have to do next that does not permit you to run suicides, or where suicides are not optimal. And you can recover your mastery points fairly cost efficiently. As we can notice, my units are still above 900. I believe I was at like about 1000 units when we started, and we have changed a couple things here already, obviously. And now with these 10 points, it's pretty much perfect for me to now go and max out the Despair Mastery, max out my deep wounds, which is a thing I kind of love to do, even though I don't typically run bleed champions as my primarily champions, but still it is quite useful. And obviously Nick Fury still is a quite bit favorite of, not favorite, but I absolutely love using that guy. So deep wounds is a mastery that I like to have maxed at pretty much all the time. And yeah, you still have 1 point left over to add in Glass Cannon. Now, what's the best and the most beautiful thing about kind of like shifting mastery points this way, leaving your defense at 18 and no more, also gives you kind of like a freedom to spec into suicides, for instance, right now, without using many more units. So at this point, I can just recover all of my proficiencies. I will go to my bare bones skeleton structure, as you saw at the beginning, which is basically max parry, max stupefy, and 1 in dexterity. And at that point, we are going to be pretty much to kind of like a beginning where we started off, where was my mastery setup before I kind of like took all the points away from it. And yeah, so we're gonna max out stupefy, nearly there. And that leaves us with 8 points, right? And that is plenty for you to simply spec into suicides without Mystic Dispersion. And that is like an easy enough option for you to do as well. And now we have pretty much kind of like returned to a different suicide setup that also incorporates deep wounds, which is probably my most frequently used suicide mastery setup. So this is kind of like my base suicide setup. If I don't need Mystic Dispersion, this is exactly what I do. And so basically in the course of the video, you guys saw my 3 most used mastery setups. We started off with the suicides with Mystic Dispersion, then we went on to a Mystic Dispersion mastery setup without suicides but with max deep wounds, and now we have ended up with a setup where we have maxed out deep wounds and suicides but no Mystic Dispersion. So that is always kind of like the alternative cost that you have to keep in mind. You can have 2 out of 3, you can never have all 3 together, at least not to my knowledge, or not kind of like effectively without sacrificing and compromising the kind of core of the build, because attack, offensive core is pretty much always the same, defense stays always the same, and proficiency stay always the same, and then the remaining points that are typically about 8 to 10 points get scattered in between Limber and Mystic Dispersion, between deep wounds and despair, or between suicide 3. So those 3 are kind of like the optional trees that you have, where you have to pick in between 2 of those trees. So obviously you might have some personal preferences, what you like to do more, what you like to do less. Maybe you have slight tweaks in defense, which is also fair enough. But altogether, I just wanted to kind of show that idea where you have basically 3 of these extension trees, which is suicide tree, which is deep wounds tree, and which is proficiencies for Mystic Dispersion. You can have 2 out of those 3 things at any time fairly easily, and you can swap all of these mastery setups really kind of cost efficiently. It really doesn't take also too long. And yeah, so currently I do not think that it's not that I think, I don't want to have suicides active for the fights that I'm going to be doing next. And because my AQ champions currently aren't too suicide friendly, the ones that I have brought in, so I will simply take the suicides off and put on my kind of like base setup there without suicides, with Mystic Dispersion and with Deep Wounds active. So that is pretty much it for the idea of the video. I hope you guys found it kind of like helpful, because I didn't want to just kind of like showcase 3 pictures of what is my mastery setup and why. And I also definitely wanted to show that whole idea of how you switch them about relatively cheaply without touching the points that you don't need to touch, leaving defensive setup as is, always kind of like stable and stagnant. And also the kind of simple idea of you to be able to understand what you can and cannot have. And the fact that there are basically 3 different sections, which is suicide, which is deep wounds, which is Mystic Dispersion. And you can always have any 2 of those, whichever 2 you prefer, whichever 2 you want to run. And then the third one, unfortunately, you do not have enough mastery points for. And that is basically your alternative price that you pay. So basically, if you want to run suicide masteries and if you want to have Mystic Dispersion, unfortunately you need to kind of like leave deep wounds out of your mastery setup, and by doing that you will have plenty of mastery points to make the setup that's more important for you. And yeah, so we're basically again now at the crossroad, at the setup point where I can easily put on Mystic Dispersion if I choose to. I can put on suicides if I choose to, or I can leave as is, and quite often I simply go questing like this as well, and kind of like make the choice at a later time. But I think that will pretty much do for today's video. We kind of like did a whole circle, or even a bit more than a circle, of my mastery changes. It didn't cost me even 300 units. There's like 250 units to shift in between like 3 or 4 different mastery setups. So changing masteries can be annoying and can get expensive, and this is kind of like my way of saving my units as well, because I don't do it unnecessarily, and when I do it, it typically costs me about 50 to 100 units like per shift, per change, if you will. So I think it's fairly affordable price, and yeah, that's pretty much it for today's video. Once again, I hope you guys find it useful. If you do, hit that like button, hit that sub button, hit all the buttons, and I'm gonna catch you guys soon. See ya.